Hello everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Altengrad city in City Skylines. In today's video, we move forward in time. We leave the 1950s and continue into the 1960s, where we will start by talking about the architecture of the Central European Eastern Bloc countries. To quickly sum up the previous decade in the city, we talked about the war memorials, ongoing housing crisis, socialist realism and its projects, industry, and we lightly touched public transportation, cars, trains, and infrastructure. As with the previous time jump, we must introduce new vehicles to the city. Here they are. Some new railway diesel engines, a couple of new cars, including some really popular ones that were used well past this decade, trucks, a bus, and most importantly, trams, the legendary Czechoslovak Tatra T3. I wasn't satisfied with the available assets, so I overhauled one from the workshop, optimized it so it looks better for the first-person rides. In the city, we will leave the outskirts and move back inside and revisit two places that will receive a rework with much more modern buildings. So while I'm going to be doing that in the time-lapse, let's talk about the architecture of the 1960s. That is, of course, a huge topic, so today we will exclude all the large housing projects, as that requires its own video and probably not just one. Throughout the second half of the 1950s, socialist realism started to lose its influence and eventually completely disappeared from architecture when it wasn't the mandatory style anymore. That was a major step towards more modern architecture, but it's also important to mention certain events and subsequent political changes, as it's all inevitably tied to city development and even architecture itself. In 1953, East Germany and Czechoslovakia saw major worker protests against the government demanding economic changes, followed in 1956 protests in Poland and the Hungarian uprising later in the same year. The protests were violently crushed, followed by various purges, repressions, or tightening of control in certain ways, but it also made the communist regimes worried about the sustainability of their policies, so they loosened their tight control in certain other areas to stabilize the general societal climate and, most importantly, prevent further unrest. One of such loosenings were in the construction sector, where architects experienced some more freedom in their work. After reading some experiences of the architects from these times and looking up the history of certain specific projects in the Central European region, such as the buildings I'm doing in the city, it is really difficult to generalize. But we cannot gloss over it like that, what would be the point of the video then, so let's at least try to sum up some more common things, while keeping in mind that there were significant exceptions that would be impossible to completely map. So let's focus on the environment that architects found themselves in before we actually move to the architecture itself. Architects were mostly concentrated in big construction or design companies, but we can also find examples of top architects forming groups in these companies or even creating smaller companies of their own, which was only possible in the more politically loosened times. Speaking of politics, it played a huge role and heavily influenced the overall climate that these architects faced. It was important what kind of relationships the architects had with the various Communist Party officials and whether or not they were in the Communist Party themselves. If an architect had some falling out with the regime, it might have ended their careers entirely or prevented them from traveling abroad, taking inspiration outside, being able to present unusual designs, competing for more interesting projects, having more leverage against the pressures of investors and construction companies, and so on and so on. Various projects started differently depending on the investor and the overall importance. Investors such as a big company might have selected an architect directly, usually through some previous contacts. Certain more political projects, like some government centers or important offices, had an architectural competition at the start, but usually with only selected or invited architects, sometimes with the condition that the architect had to be a member of the party. In other cases, more or less free architectural competitions were held, similar to what we know today. The very mundane projects, like some buildings for various city amenities, were usually assigned to be designed by the local construction companies. The committees judging the projects would have various experts as well as regime or government officials, depending on the importance of the building. In the overall process, from the initial proposal all the way to the construction phase, architects faced pressures from all sides to simplify, unify, cheapen, or otherwise alter their designs. This is where the monopolized and industrialized construction sector, focusing on unification and rationalization, proved to be an obstacle. The selection of various structural elements, products, materials, or technologies was limited because of that, and the manufacturers had very little motivation to change that. We need to understand one thing. The vast majority of structures built were not some unique buildings, but the large-scale residential projects, together with buildings for all the associated services. And the construction industry was reorganized to accommodate primarily that kind of construction. So architects were in a difficult situation if they wanted to build something unique without using prefabricated concrete panels or gray concrete in general and various standardized elements. They then needed to be very persuasive or pull strings, even political ones, to push for something different. Also, architects started to complain that the craftsmanship started to steeply decline because of the accelerated industrialization. Although in the 1960s there were still older generations of some pre-war craftsmen and company directors who were sometimes more understanding of the architect's needs. Sometimes the only option, though, was to invite construction companies from other socialist countries, or even outside of the Eastern Bloc, Sweden, Italy, UK, West Germany, which was actually not that rare. All of this, of course, largely depended on the importance of the project, the investor, and some political engagement. Modern buildings were seen as building the country's image and showcasing its abilities. In the end, there are examples of buildings from this time period that are considered good in terms of design, material choice, and quality of work, and then there are, of course, buildings that are not so good. Unfortunately, sometimes not because of the original design, but because of the final execution, lack of quality materials, technologies, and so on. Let's continue with styles. What kind of architectural styles were used in the 1960s in our Central European region of the Eastern Bloc? There was a huge hunger for modern architecture, which was even stronger after its artificial, almost decade-long suppression. Not just architects, but even certain officials and investors were eager to start building something new, something recent. Architects could dust off their older ideas or come up with some new designs, taking inspiration abroad from international conferences, exhibitions, and so on. Here I would like to say a quote from the architect of the famous Hotel Thermal in Carlsbad, Czech Republic, hosting the International Film Festival. Quote, "We had a good idea of what's going on abroad, but we were not individualistic or ingenious enough to come up with something extraordinary. There are only a handful of such geniuses who come up with something new. We just evolve hints that interest us into other forms." End quote. I think this quote nicely introduces the architecture of the region and how it took various inspirations from around the world, recent and also older, as there was a strong generation of pre-war architects still. The most notable inspirations came from functionalism, international, technicism, brutalism, and various other modernist projects. Combined with the local conditions and overall societal climate, the result was a somewhat unique architecture. Let's first digress a little with brutalism. I often see the word thrown around a little too much. It seems that in the context of the Eastern Bloc, the word is often misused to just lump together everything built during the communist reign. Sometimes it's mentioned as some official style, sometimes it's called Soviet, even in the Western countries. If the building somehow feels brutal, for whatever reason, which is insanely subjective, it is somehow automatically a brutalist architecture. This is all a complete nonsense. What exactly is brutalism? That is a question that led me down a very deep rabbit hole in the past few weeks, and it's probably going to be the best to just point you to some sources instead of trying to come up with some superficial explanation. Sources like, for example, the very difficult to read article by British architectural critic Rainer Banham, The New Brutalism, and some other books and other sources that will be in the video description. But I would like to say a few points anyway. So first of all, a brutalist building should meet certain requirements like specific use of material, the show of structure, and creating an image, as Banham writes. So just the subjective feeling that it's brutal is not enough. Apparently the style, or sometimes called movement, is difficult to characterize. Its roots are said to be in Scandinavia and the UK, but it evolved, and various projects or overall trends received the brutalist description retrospectively. Some architects even objected to their projects being called brutalism. Overall, it was a late modernist approach to architecture with various popular elements that architects used in many different forms. Some of them used it with close ties to urban planning principles, like in the UK, but many others were simply using the trending elements and approaches to build highly expressive, unique buildings all around the world. What is probably the most typical brutalist architecture can now be found mostly in the UK and then the rest of Western Europe and the Americas. It was used for housing projects as well as corporate headquarters or churches. Lots of popularizing articles about brutalism are incredibly superficial and sometimes completely wrong about some basic historical facts. So I encourage you, if you want to learn more about the style, to instead focus on works and interviews made by the architects or historians who had something to do with the style, or at the very least articles heavily referencing those. Let's now return to the Eastern Bloc of our Central European region. I once again stress the geography here because there are significant differences between the countries, which is one of the reasons I want to go into these details. The common internet simplification when it comes to architecture is to think of the Eastern Bloc as one unified entity, or simply speak of Soviet architecture in the whole bloc. Nonsense. What I want to illustrate with brutalism is the meaning behind that quote from earlier about taking the inspirations and creating something different, something local that has clear differences compared to the other regions, but still using certain common elements. This approach is of course not unique to just Central Europe, that's simply how architecture works, although since there were big differences between the conditions in various parts of Europe, it shaped the architecture a bit more than, for example, today when we compare some modern works. Can we then talk about the same style anymore, or should we be a little more nuanced and speak of the inspirations, mention those common elements, but not simplify the project into one rigid style definition? I'd rather not simplify like that, especially when it comes to brutalism, as it just brushes aside the other inspirations, which is a huge shame. And because of that, it's a little easy today to turn the public discussion into, yeah, everything was just some ugly communist brutalism, let's tear it down, who cares? Although this situation is somewhat improving, albeit slowly and maybe too slowly for some buildings because they are already gone. It's maybe just a little shame that brutalism is called that, instead of something more pleasant, I guess. People wouldn't jump to these weird associations, maybe. Anyway, let's start taking a look at some of the local buildings to not only talk theory. I'm of course not going to show every single building from the 60s of the region, as there are hundreds, but there is a link in the video description to a site called Socialist Modernism, which has a neat list of projects built in the Eastern Bloc if you are interested. Also, some of the buildings I show here were not finished in the 1960s, but they were very much a product of 1960s design. Overall, the 1960s and late 50s were a time of experiments to bring something completely new and see what would work and what wouldn't in the local conditions. Certain architectural trends from abroad also appeared a little later and then stayed longer. The projects that took inspiration from brutalism are mostly not as expressive as the Western examples, and the raw nature of materials is relatively suppressed with not that strong accent on volume or scale. Le Corbusier's principles of modern architecture were very popular, although not with everyone, so using pillars and raising the buildings off ground, using flat roofs, free floor plans, horizontal window lines, and light facades. Popular was also the use of high-rises, especially when accented by building another much shorter part of the building with larger footprint. These high-rises then stood alone in various places around the city, but when I say high-rises, I mean around 100 meters max. And there are of course notable exceptions to all of this, so buildings that were highly expressive, showing the material, being highly technical, taking inspirations from various other styles, not following the high-rise principles, and so on and so on. Again, impossible to just put every single building from this time period into one group. Common projects included lots of hotels, offices, new forms of large department stores, houses of culture, basically community centers, and all other types as well. Now let's talk about materials. Concrete, glass, stone, ceramics, steel, and aluminium were popular. Concrete was used as the main structural material. Raw concrete was not widespread. One Czech source describes that the concrete industry was not able to provide high-quality concrete for raw surface finishes. But architects got creative and designed various decorative panels using larger rocks embedded in cement. But more on that in a special video about concrete technology sometime later. Well, actually in the next one. Various other surface finishes were used on concrete, plasters, paints. Concrete was also used for some surface tiles. Glass and metal started to be heavily used for light facade panels. These panels were at first really wanted by the architects because they would allow the use of that modern architectural principle of light facades. They also offer some economic benefits. They can be prefabricated in a factory, so it was in line with the established principles, and therefore architects were able to persuade the manufacturers and the central planners to start producing them. But because of unification and standardization, they started to appear everywhere, looking very similar and sometimes exactly the same between some more mundane buildings, with few exceptions. The panels would end up on mostly offices, schools, train stations, some hotels, and a few residential buildings. Also, some contained asbestos. Glass alone was used a lot more for larger windows or various decorations, railings even. Structural steel started to be more available and widespread. Aluminium was used for various frames, covers, or decorative panels. Stone, like granite or marble, were heavily used as decorative panels on pillars, walls, and mostly on floors, inside and outside, in open spaces, plazas, stairs, and so on. Ceramic cladding and tiles were used similarly to stone while being cheaper, but like the light facade panels, the ceramics were heavily unified and you could find exactly the same ones in various buildings. Art was a very common part of the project. This included various abstract sculptures, mosaics, and then paintings or reliefs, usually with socialist or the so-called builders' themes, as in building socialism. Situation with statues, personal statues of some leaders, for example, depended on the specific political climate, but new ones were not that common as in the 1950s. Large plazas were typical, sometimes even too large, usually completely paved without much greenery, but with various accessories like concrete planters, benches, and so on. Large-scale demolitions were common before the construction started. Big, older city blocks were being torn down for even mundane new buildings, not to mention infrastructure, but we are probably going to deal with that topic in some later videos. This was presented to the public as a way of constructing better, modern, cleaner environment. Sometimes it was presented as just, yeah, it's happening, without any further comments, but we can also find certain critique of these demolitions. In case of Hotel Thermal that I showed earlier, 30 buildings were demolished, including villas, a post office, and a school. So that was a brief and certainly not complete introduction to this decade. In City Skylines it gets a bit tricky. The selection of buildings for the 50s to 80s is very limited, so after going through the better ones, I will have to get creative. Fortunately, because the architects got inspired around the world, I can use some other buildings as well, without being too inaccurate. Also, some buildings were built in slightly different decades in real life, but I will use them in the city anyway, as the designs could easily pass in these other times. Let's not forget that Altengrad is a fictional city, so try not to see these buildings from the perspective of their real-life counterparts. Well, the background got a little longer today, so we are just in time to see that second part of the time-lapse, and that is the construction of this second, like a smaller project between that Monastery Island, the river where the Monastery Island is, and the terminus station, right? So I'm going to zoom out in the time-lapse so you can see where that exactly is. And in here, there was the place of that tank battle. A couple of buildings got damaged during the war, and the rest of the block was just torn down to make way for something newer. and something newer is definitely this. Now, this tower is the Jeleniak building from Gdańsk, Poland. I think I showed it in that picture when I was talking about the light facade panels, so that's exactly this. The name of the building comes from the word green, because it is very green, as you can see, because of the color of those panels. And this building also follows those modern architectural principles, as you can see. It uses, well, the light facade, of course, and it also is built on these pillars. Now, the pillars are not really visible all that much, but this building in real life was built using some kind of Swedish technology, very expensive one, apparently. And as you are entering the building like literally towers over you, right? Because it just gets wider for the upper floors. So it's looking very, very modern and unlike anything that we have seen in the city yet. So in this place, it doesn't really fit at all with all the surrounding blocks, but at the same time, it kind of does fit absolutely perfectly. It's just some kind of first proper modern high-rise in the city that is really going to put this this entire series into this proper modern times, right? Together with the vehicles, for example, and all the other elements that we are going to be introducing in the 1960s. So this particular project or sub-project was super simple. I only placed the high-rise and then some kind of lower portions right next to it. I also put that second tower in there. That's probably not exactly accurate. I should not have done that, but I just felt like I wanted to fill that block with something slightly more. But otherwise, this little build in here, this refurbishment, is absolutely simple, super simple in the game. I'm just going to be building some more planters around the area. I wasn't exactly sure of that corner next to the railways. I kind of made it look like a construction site because I did not really find any fitting buildings. So, you know, there were buildings, they were torn down, but nothing was built, in their place. So maybe there was some kind of plan. Maybe that plan was just never realized. But who knows? I'm just going to leave it like that. Anyway, I completely skipped, because of the background part, the first part of today's project. So we are going to see it in just a couple of moments after we are done with this particular time lapse. But that first part was, of course, in that old market square that saw some major damage during the war, and of course there used to be that old bridge that had to be torn down because it was heavily damaged. And a couple of episodes back we built that new steel bridge, and we also prepared that main avenue, and we needed to just fill all the rest of the blocks around it with something. So there were also a couple of buildings disconnected from their original blocks, so the city planners decided to tear them down as well. And now this place, as we can see, is dominated by that blue building. Now that is a building from Poland, again from Warsaw. That is the Central Department Store, if I say it right. And it's looking slightly differently in real life. In real life, it's part of like a bigger block, and apparently it's not standing anymore, at least not in its like original looks, how it did when it was first built. It's a bit older building in real life, but as you can see, it's just very modern looking. It also follows those modern architectural principles, light facade again, and the raised first floor. As you can see, it kind of looks like it's floating a little bit, and it also has that somewhat smaller roof portion floor, something that was also very popular usually during the late 50s, in Czechoslovakia, and apparently in Poland as well, I suppose some other places too. This place also, I kind of fiddled with this place a little bit more with this first sub-project. As you can see, I built all these open surfaces. It's really satisfying that they are being used with all the pedestrians. As you can see right here, those huge stairs leading to the waterfront and kind of opening up this entire area. So, overall, like a very big change in this place, but it's looking okay. Who knows how it's going to stand the test of time. Maybe it's going to decay, and maybe it's just not going to look like this. But right now, when it's new, it's kind of the marvel of modern architecture, in Altengrad. And it kind of fits the new bridge and the main avenue and the geometry. And by the way, with this particular view, you can of course see that high-rise building there in the distance. So it is going to be very visible from all around the city. By the way, the new high-rise is not the highest building in the entire city. And you can actually maybe kind of see that in this view. There is a higher building. That's the Socialist Realism Hotel. And that's exactly how it was in Poland as well. So these kinds of smaller modern high-rises, those were very common all around the place. And yeah, it's just something modern in Altengrad. I really like it. Now, speaking of modern things in Altengrad, we also have those new trams. Yeah, the T3s. They are not everywhere because they are right now very new in the city. So I kind of want to gradually just put them on these lines. So we are going to see these very old trams for some times. That's actually kind of accurate because even in Prague in the 60s and 70s and maybe even slightly later, you can see pictures with these really old trams, and then somewhere in the middle the T3s and T2s and T1s maybe as well. So that's how we are going to see it in here as well. So that's just going to add something more interesting on the rails, right? We're not just going to use one vehicle types. Anyway, that is going to be all for today's Altengrad episode, guys. In the next video, I already decided that we are going to follow up on that cement factory video, and we are going to build a prefabrication plant. We are going to talk about concrete, about prefabrication in general, and it's just going to pave the way towards the housing project in some future episodes, all right? So thank you for watching this one. Hope you liked it. If you did, then please do all the things as usual. Big thanks to all the channel supporters who decided to become channel members. I really appreciate all your support. Thank you so much. All right, take care. Goodbye.